Welcome to Planetary Calendar. I'm Ralph D. AMICIS. We're going to talk about the astrology of the United States today. And this is a particular pet subject of mine because for many years people have discussed, mainly astrologers, what's the proper astrological chart for the United States. Okay? It's a good question. It's like many topics. For years, astrologers discussed the proper birth time and chart for Jesus Christ. When was the proper birth time? When were the stars aligned? Many discussions have gone on like this historically, and we know the signing of the Declaration of Independence is the important day. It's July 4th, as we all know. We celebrate it with fireworks and parades. But what time of the day? And for many years now, the popular chart that's been used for 5:10 p.m., which I assume has to do with maybe when John Hancock first signed the Declaration of Independence. That would be great, and that it's an interesting chart. It puts Sagittarius at the rising, which means, optimism, looking out towards the future and such. But was that really the intention of the Declaration of Independence? It's an 8th house sun, which has to do with the collective use of power. It puts Libra actually at the midheaven in the 11th house, which does show a bit about the willingness to work across borders for business. And there's a lot to be said for, and people do forecasts based upon it. But, there's a thing about astrologers that's actually very similar to a joke about Italians, which is, what do you get when you put 12 Italians in a room? You get 13 opinions. And astrologers are a lot like that. And it's because we all come to our understanding of astrology through our training, yes, but first starting with our own stellar pattern. So if, for instance, you go to see an astrologer who's born with the sun in Sagittarius and the moon in Gemini, and Leo rising, you're going to get a very different interpretation than someone who's born with the sun in Scorpio, the moon in Taurus, and, Capricorn rising. Why? Because their perspective on the world, what they consider important, is different. Like I said, 12 people, 13 opinions. Well, for us, in our work, we come to it from a very interesting place because we have backgrounds in environmental design and health. We're very well known in ergonomic designers and environmental designers and practitioners of feng shui. We've written multiple books on the topic, starting with our feng shui and the tango and 12 easy lessons, and on from there. And then we also are people who work in health for many years. We're both master herbalists, LAHNI and myself, and we're naturopathic physicians, and approaching 5 decades in both of those fields. So if you stick in these fields long enough, you actually, you pick up a bunch, and you don't hopefully forget too much. So as a result, when we look at things, we look at charts in certain ways that work well for those two systems. And one thing we use, and I have to kind of set the ground rules here, is we use what's called whole sign houses. So in other words, we don't use Placidus houses. We don't vary every single house cusp based upon the latitude. Basically, the first house is the first sign on the east in the eastern horizon. The 7th house across the way is the 7th sign. The 10th house is the 10th sign. The 4th house is the 4th sign. And then the ascendant always shows up in the 1st house, of course, and the descendant always shows up in the 7th house. The midheaven and IC can appear in the 9th, 10th, and 11th houses for the midheaven, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th houses for the IC. So, for instance, a person who has their IC in the 3rd house, but their midheaven in the 9th house, will have a very different orientation on the world from someone who has their IC in the 5th house and their midheaven in the 11th house. And of course, the one who has the IC in the 4th house And the midheaven in the 10th house is kind of the balancing act between the two. That's where you find a lot of CEOs, because they're always balancing between, on one side, the need to research and plan for the future, 3rd house, 9th house, and the need to actually do business, bring money in, create a product, 5th house, 11th house. So, balancing act. That's why CEOs like to face directly at the door, so they can have both sides of their desk equally open. Now, the other thing we use a lot of is location astrology, and there's various different parts of that. One is what's called AstroCartography, which was developed by Jim Lewis out here in California and San Francisco quite a few years ago. He's really the one. It's existed, I believe, before then, but he brought it to a whole nother level by being able to use computers, and that actually tells you what planets are overhead. The other ones are location-based charts, which will basically tell you what direction, compass direction, the different planets were for different charts. And then what we do call is the 12 terrestrial houses. That's our particular name for a concept that comes out of both geomancy and feng shui, in which the way in which the human body projects upon a space programs that space in certain ways based upon the body's kinesiological response to an environment. Whole other topic, but very effective. And it's something we actually talk a great deal about in our book, A Planetary Calendar Astrology, which is the companion book to the Planetary Calendar series of calendars, because there's a whole healing system built into the calendar about using the 12 terrestrial houses with the lunations, meditations, and essential oils to help clear a person's space and clear obstructions out of their life over the course of a year, over the course of all the lunations of a year. So, with this as the ground rules, these are some pretty sophisticated tools, but they're also very practical tools because they tell you, where you actually are physically, and it tells you, especially with the whole sign houses, how your body is functioning in certain ways and what your body needs. So it's a very, like I said, practical, down-to-earth system where, there's a great deal in astrology, which is very esoteric. It's very much about spiritual development. And, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But astrology, like many professional fields, have a lot of different dimensions and applications. And it's such an ancient field that astrologers have been finding ways to apply it for years. One of the episodes you might want to watch from Planetary Calendar is it's one of our astrologers chatting series about fine wines, in which we equate the major fine wine grapes to the major planets and celestial objects. To give you a little hint, Chardonnay, that big beautiful golden wine, definitely the sun. Yes? So, let's explain why we believe that the chart that is being currently used by many people for 5:10 p.m. on July 4th, not quite right. And here's why. This was basically an agreement. It was an agreement between the states, and at the time in which it was made, it was essentially a partnership of rules. They were not forming a cohesive country. They were forming the United States of America. States' rights were very important. And part of the original deal was that if a state joined and didn't want to stay in, they could leave. Now, this was argued in court later on, and the decision is really kind of nebulous because it had entirely to do with pensions, about when Texas came in to the United States and then left again, how they were going to pay pensions. You remember, Texas was an independent country twice. It was an independent, and it joined the United States, and it left again, and then it rejoined again. So this is really a much more complicated subject than we are often taught about in our history books. But it was really a group of very independent states that came together. And at the time, the federal government was very weak. Realized that, up until the Civil War, 1860s, the only revenue that the federal government got was from port taxes. There was no income tax. There really wasn't real, estate taxes, I believe. It was primarily port taxes. And a lot of what the Civil War was about was that the South, which was not industrial, wanted to be able to buy from Europe, from European countries and companies, much more cheaply than they would have to buy from the North, whose industry was still younger and their prices had to be higher as a result. And this is why Rhett Butler from Gone in the Wind was so popular. He was a smuggler. He was able to bring them products from Europe so much more cheaply. And that was part of the whole issue. If the South left, the federal government was going to lose a major portion of their income. They always say that, Lincoln saved the Union. In truth, Lincoln made the Union because up until then, the federal government was not that strong. Now, of course, there were many other issues about why the Civil War was fought, and of course, the issue of the stain of slavery is paramount to that. But the economics of it were more down to earth. So, when you look back at the original founding, it was a fairly loose confederation of states. And as many typical business agreements are made, when we look at the charts for that, and this is very common in business astrology, what they do is they don't pick the time when you sign the contract. They pick noontime. And the reason you choose noon for the location is that what is happening is you are creating an entity and showing it to the whole world. It is the sun at its zenith. It's the highest point in the sky, and we now exist. And all of the efforts that go into the course of that day are the culmination of this sunflower reaching up towards the sky and showing its face to the heavens. That's why they use noontime, and it's very effective. Trying to figure out the time for individual charts, when do they sign this or that? Well, what time do the meetings start in the morning? When do they have lunch? What time did the first person sign? Noontime works really well for that. Now, what really set me off on this was that I put up the chart, the AstroCartography, for the 5:10 p.m. on July 4th. Sun at 13 degrees Cancer. Coincidentally, the degree of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. You have to remember that Benjamin Franklin was the country's preeminent astrologer, and we ourselves, as publishers of the Planetary calendar, which has been published since 1949, we are part of that lineage of almanac makers, of astrological almanac makers that goes back in our country to Ben Franklin. We very much appreciate Ben's efforts. It has Jupiter conjunct the Sun, planet of good luck. Venus loosely conjunct the Sun and very much conjunct Jupiter, the planet of love and harmony, also in Cancer and love of home. It's a very nice chart. It has Saturn in Libra, which is the exalted position. It means people working in harmony together. So it's got a lot of very nice qualities in the chart. But I did an astrocartography chart for the 5:10 chart, 5:10 p.m., and I look at the chart, and it doesn't make any sense in the United States in terms of how they developed over time. You have, Saturn is overhead, but Saturn's way over, past the tip of Maine. It's actually up over Canada. Saturn's the force. Neptune, who they didn't even know about at the time, is practically one of the only planets over the United States at the time. They didn't even know about Neptune. Well, they had just was barely discovered. Definitely at the time, 1776, it was not discovered. It wasn't discovered until the 1800s. So, where's the imprint? California, the most populous state. I think I just read something the other day that California had 39.9 million people. It was apparently stalled out there. It was still growing, but hadn't quite made 40 million. Well, if you add in all the people who live here under the radar, which there's a whole bunch, We're up over 40 million. We're in the most populous state out here in California, and yet there is no major planets. No major planets over California. The only thing that passed overhead was what was under the feet was Pallas Athena passing through LA, an icy line. The moon's nodes was passing off the coast. There should be more significant markers if this chart is correct. There's not even powerful, icy lines. There's a moon icy line that runs out through Colorado over through the Rockies. It just doesn't sync. It doesn't make sense. And the thing about astrocartography charts is they make sense. That's the thing about location charts. They make sense. They're, right there on the physical world. So we looked at the chart for noon in the for the United States, July 4th at noon. And rather than having adventurous Sagittarius at the rising, very optimistic, which I think when they signed this, they were not optimistic. They were not, they were planning for the future, but they were also, a bit worried because they were declaring independence against the most powerful empire on the planet, But if you look at the chart for noontime, which puts, of course, the Sun, Jupiter, and Venus, and Mercury all up at the midheaven, right around the midheaven, at 13 degrees, up in the 10th house. So it means that's where you would expect a country to be. You would expect an organization to be, a 10th house. Remember, this is near the summer solstice. You would expect them to be there, visible. But it puts Libra at the rising. Remember that this was the United States of America. It wasn't the one state, it was the United States, plural, of America. Libra. Who's there also? That's Saturn in exaltation. Well, the thing about Saturn and Libra is these are the people who will say to you, what do you think? Let's go to dinner. Where do you want to go? No, if get two people, they're going to go back and forth saying, well, where do you want to go? It's not that they don't have an opinion about where they want to go. They want to make sure that they know what the other person's opinion is, and so they can work out a deal between them. They can work in cooperation that's going to have the two of them in harmony together, and they can cooperate. That makes sense. And it's also Saturn and Libra. Saturn is a conservative planet. But in Libra, it's also fair. So it's a way of saying, I am, for home and apple pie and the flag. But I'm also fair about it. If you don't like apple pie, maybe you're gluten insensitive. Maybe you don't want to have apple pie. Maybe you want to use maybe you want to use a rice flour on your apple strudel. That's okay too. And that Libra, that Saturn and Libra, I think has a lot to do with, as a rising, we're seen as a country of fairness. We're seen as a country of laws. And that's what's real interesting. Saturn and Libra makes the United States seem like a place of laws. And we're famous throughout the world for that. It's for our respect for the courts and for law. It puts the sun in the 5th house. It's the house, the moon in the 5th house with Pallas Athena in Aquarius. That's a very technological moon. That's a very innovative moon. It's about the family, the moon. It's about in a very innovative sign. And you have to say that the United States has been very innovative in their creation of how they put families together. It's part of the melting pot of the world. Well, it's also how many times do you see families that are these very complex groups? They're very non-traditional. We, in some ways, have very much created that. You have Jupiter highly elevated, and we have in terms of our position, has been really strong. And it's interesting is it puts Leo in the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of business, and it's the house that relates a lot to commerce. Well, the United States is still the biggest economy, and we don't have the most number of people. We have 300 million people. China's well over 1 billion. India is also, but we're a bigger economy, in part because we're blessed through our geography, which is once again that Saturn and Libra. It's all of our huge river systems are a huge benefit. But this is where it gets real interesting, and this is what really told me that we were onto something here. When we looked at the AstroCartography chart for noontime, you really see the lesson. Okay? What's the most founding American concept? Plymouth Rock. You landed on Plymouth Rock. It's the idea that so many of us are immigrants. Now, not all the immigrants were willing immigrants. I think it was Malcolm X who said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. The issue of those who were brought here against their will, which includes not only many African Americans, people, African descent, but also indentured servants, criminals, prisoners, political prisoners who were sent out of their country. Plymouth Rock. Rock is Saturn. Okay? Saturn in Libra. Where is Saturn in this chart? Saturn ascending passes right through Boston, the most conservative of cities, the most staid of cities, and passes right through where Plymouth Rock is. Boom. Saturn rising, the beginning point, the ascendant, Saturn rising right through Plymouth Rock. Okay? Where's Jupiter? Jupiter's overhead. Comes right down through Detroit. Right through Detroit, the line, it's an MC line, Detroit, the place where they make, the place of great cars. Jupiter is in the game of chess, the knight. It's the one who travels great distances. Isn't that about our cars? Traveling great distances, goes right through Detroit. And what's funny is it goes down through the East Coast and goes through Florida, and goes practically through the town of Jupiter, Florida, which I think is just absolutely charming. Venus comes down fairly close to Chicago, and also down through, the Midlands, the great farming areas as well, and goes into the Gulf as well. And this is what's really great. Mars. Now, Mars in this chart's in Gemini, okay? But it's Mars. The MC line comes right down through the middle of the country and goes right through the heart of Texas. Isn't that perfect? Mars, cowboys, In fact, even cowboys are very much Mars and Gemini. They're two-parted. There's the cowboy on the top and the horse underneath, right? They got two spurs, which is metal, Mercury, Gemini. Great symbolism. Uranus. Okay, Uranus is overhead. Where's Uranus goes through? It goes right down through Salt Lake City. Where's Uranus in the chart? Uranus is also in Gemini. And Uranus is about that which is alternative. It was only discovered in the 1700s and isn't, even till today, Salt Lake City is the home of the alternative religion. It was a religion a major religion which was founded in the United States. Remember, many of the original New Englanders were people who came here for religious freedom. Not only them, but actually many people throughout the United States. Religious freedom is one of our primary tenets. Uranus, of course, would be about religious freedom and the Mormons' right to religious freedom. Uranus going right down through Salt Lake. And then California. What about California? You would expect a major line over there. There isn't a major planetary line, but what there are major asteroid lines. Remember, the asteroid belt contains a huge number of particles, huge number of pieces. It contains about 5 big asteroids. If you combined them all together, they'd be the size of a small planet, but it creates almost like a condenser field, out beyond Mars. And it has a lot to do with how energy transmits. So it's lots and lots and lots of little pieces. Well, isn't that California? It's the most populous state. And who goes through there? You have Estrella, which has to do with legal issues. And you have Pasadena, which has to do with skills. And then you have Ceres, which has to do with growing. Ceres, in fact, is a descending line, and it goes right down through the Central Valley where most of America's vegetables and fruits come from. I mean, it's the biggest growing area for what's called specialty plant products, which includes the fruits, the vegetables, in other words, not grains. Although they grow plenty of that as well. Pasadena has to do with skills, goes right through LA. And where's Pasadena in the chart? Pallas is actually out there by the moon, within 1 degree of the moon. In Aquarius, once again, innovation. And then Estrella, and actually anyone who has worked a great deal in with LA or with technology or with entertainment technology knows that it's all these very complicated legal relationships. It's all licensing. It's all about copyrights. It's all about, patent. And once again, it goes right up through the area where Silicon Valley is. Patents, communications, but it's all asteroids, which is one of the reasons why from where Saturn is rising on the East Coast and Jupiter and Venus all on the East Coast, they have a hard time taking California seriously, even though it is the most populous state and very possibly the wealthiest state. I think it's like the 5th or 6th largest economy on the planet. What's up with that? But it's because it's the asteroids. So that's my take on the proper chart. I hope you found that interesting. I hope it gets you thinking. And if anyone has ideas about this, let me know. You can find us at planetarycalendar.com. Wishing you well.